Hi everybody, and welcome to this Activism webinar where we are very delighted to at long last be promoting our book, which has been a long time in the waiting. I'm going to let my other panelists introduce themselves. I'm Nicole Westmarland. I'm a professor of criminology at Durham University, and I'll go around clockwise as people appear on my screen, in which case, Sandy, you're next.
Hi, I'm Sandy Ruxton. I'm Honorary Research Fellow in CRIBA.
Custodio?
Yeah. Hello, I'm Custodio Delgado, Professor of Sociology in University of Seville, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. We're happy you could join us. Anna-Lena?
My name is Anna-Lena Almqvist, and I work as an associate professor in social work at the Mälardalen University in Sweden, and I'm also very happy to be here.
Thank you, and thank you for coming off your holiday time to join us. I think one of the things that we've realised in writing this book, which is a key challenge in doing European research, is the different holiday timing cultures of the different nations. Stephen?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow in the Department of Sociology at Durham University.
Thank you. And could I ask you to share the slides, please, Stephen?
Yes, of course, yeah.
I do have one of my children with me today. The school holidays seems to have started in some places in the UK, but not in others. But we're well and truly in the thick of it in the north east of England. So they may or may not give an appearance at some point. He's mainly being bribed by biscuits at the moment. So again, welcome to the launch of our book, Men's Activism to End Violence Against Women, Voices from Spain, Sweden and the UK. Sorry, somebody's having some issues with sound in the chat. Would you be able to look at that for me, Stephen?
I can't see the chat and do the slides, unfortunately.
Okay. Sandy, would you be able to look at the chat?
I can look at it.
Thank you. It seems to be okay for others, actually, so it might be
okay.
their end.
Oh, actually, I can see the chat now, sorry.
That's okay. And could we go to the next slide? That would be great. Excellent. So this is our book, our hotly debated cover, which is always one of the hardest things to choose when you've got a number of authors. You can see the authors here on screen. You were just introduced to most of us. The one who we are missing is Linn Egeberg Holmgren, who is also on annual leave in Sweden. So she's not able to join us, but that is not to say that she wasn't very much an important crucial part of our team. So it's today that it is actually launched. This is literally hot off the press. You can order the book from today from Policy Press. You can get 20% discount when you order from them directly. Or you can also access it for free if you want an e-copy. So it says open access in EPUB, which I believe isn't an actual some kind of COVID related pub that now exists, an EPUB, but I think it also works on the Kindle if you click the EPUB link, somebody was saying on Twitter, but you can also just download it as a PDF. So completely free if you just want to read it on a screen, or 20% off if you want a nice copy for your bookshelf. Next slide, thank you, Stephen. Okay, so we're going to go into a presentation now, and then there'll be a time at the end to ask us all questions. So why do this book then? Well, many have argued that men must engage further in the movement to end violence against women. I know that this is a debated topic by some, but I think I'm speaking for all of the authors on the book who, by saying that we personally believe that it is important for men and boys to engage further in ending violence against women and girls. So we were interested from that perspective at looking at what the structural and individual, the personal factors might be that might enable and support this engagement. So we we had two methods. We had a survey that went across the 3 countries. It's only got 40 respondents because we were quite careful in how we chose those in terms of having a snowball sample within organisations and NGOs within the countries. And we also did in-depth interviews, which lasted between 1 and 2 hours typically, where we had different participants to the ones that were in the survey. So altogether, we've got the voices, the experiences of 64 men in our book. A lot has happened since we started the research. I think we got the grant just as I was about to go on maternity leave. So I somehow, since starting the book, have got a 5-year-old, my youngest, which does go to show just how long these things can take, and academic publishing. Lots of other things have happened, personal things in the lives of other authors on the book. 2 of the most kind of significant structural things, I guess, are Brexit. You know, when we started this project, Brexit wasn't really top of our minds. It obviously became much more central as time went on. And obviously COVID as well. We were struggling to write the book with different COVID contexts in each of the 3 countries happening at different times. So we'd like to say a big thank you to the Research Advisory Group who supported us while we were doing the fieldwork, to the British Academy who funded the project, and also obviously to Policy Press who have published the work and have been patient with us and worked with us to get us to this stage. Next slide, thank you, Stephen. So why choose these European countries? Why choose these countries to focus on? It was mediated by a number of factors. There were groups of men who we knew were active in all of these countries, including specific non-governmental organisations, NGOs within the countries. So we knew that there were some similarities, but we also knew that there were some differences. We knew that there was different welfare regimes, for example. Of the 3 people who originally wrote the bid for the project, that was myself and Sandy, who are obviously based in the UK, and Keith Pringle, who was based in Sweden. So from the start, I suppose we had those 2 countries as countries which we had links in, which we understood the context of which men were speaking out in. And Spain, again, was added in partly because of the different welfare regime, but also partly because we knew that there was a lot of activity that was going on in Spain, both in NGOs and in terms of activism outside of NGOs as well. So I have provided a few notes about the Spanish context, but I didn't know, Custodio, whether you wanted to do that or whether you prefer me to do that.
Okay, I'll say a couple of words about the Spanish context. We should highlight the transition from a totalitarian system to a democratic and civil rights, from Franco society to a democratic one in the 70s. And the first main groups and feminist movement takes a big part in this process. Men's groups starts in the 80s and has grown quite big since then to nowadays. Several organizations of men for gender equality have arisen. A couple of platforms who integrate several groups, Spanish Network for Gender Equality and AIGE, and has been from the 2017 a big feminist and movement and strikes. And in the last years, couple of 3 years has been an increase in the engagement of men in gender equality. With now we have a left-wing government and Menengage Iberia, that is an association of Iberian, Spanish and Portuguese organizations, came out in 2019 and is increasing the engagement of men in gender equality, we could say. Okay, if someone wants some question afterwards, I would say happy.
Excellent, thank you, Custodio. The Swedish context, again, Anna-Lena, I made some notes, but I didn't know whether you wanted to say a few words about the Swedish context.
Yes, Nicole, I can start, and maybe you, if you want to complement with something. But in terms of, there has been a strong, the feminist movement in the 1970s contributed to a great extent to the development of family policy in Sweden towards gender equality, with the implementation of the shared parental leave in 1974, and also more a general daycare. So this has been sort of strong forces in Sweden also to increase female labor market participation. And also then in relation to what in terms of violence to women, there was an increase and development also in the 1980s of a movement towards the women's shelters, and that was sort of developed later on at the time. So, but well, I can talk a lot about yes, and we can say there also been a strong, very strong force with now a third so-called daddy months in the paid parental leave to encourage men to stay at home with their children. Now it is 90 days in the parental leave benefit that is non-shareable. So that has been that you can't sort of give, in this case, often the mother the whole time, but still Sweden has a way to go, because in 2020 30% of the shareable days in the parental leave insurance were used by men. So it's in an international perspective, it could be quite good figures, but it's still quite a way to go for gender equality in the parental leave insurance. Yes, Nicole, would you like to add something maybe?
No, I think that's great. And actually, as I come to my bit, I realise how difficult it is to summarise this in a minute or two. So thank you, Anna-Lena and Custodio, for doing that, or attempting that. So the UK context, it became, 1970s and 1980s, anti-sexist men's groups started to develop. There was the London Men's Conference in 1978, which led to which coincided with the launch of the Achilles Heel magazine. And since then, there's been a number of groups which have been developed more recently. Things like Beyond Equality, Call to Men, Future Men, White Ribbon. And the other things that we were trying to build on this work in the UK were two particularly significant PhDs, one that was conducted by Carol Wright at Huddersfield, and one by our own Stephen Burrell at Durham. Next slide, please. So the book has 5 chapters. It's got an introduction, as you might guess, which kind of covers out why we chose the countries and the method. And then it's got 3 chapters which look at how people became involved, how they found it once they were involved, and how they think that we can get more men involved. So that essentially is chapters 2, 3 and 4. And then we end with kind of recommendations and conclusions looking forward. So I'm going to cover the chapter 2, which is becoming involved. Obviously, we've only got a few minutes to do kind of justice to this, so do read the book for the full information. So these are some of the factors that came out when we asked the men about how they became involved in being active around men's violence against women. So probably the most thing that we heard most about was women normally in the family or in their close-knit communities, particularly mothers, grandmothers and partners. And in some cases, this was because they grew up in a feminist household. So they had a particularly feminist influence, normally either their mother or their grandmother, or sometimes a partner when they were at university, if they went to university. But in other cases, it was as a response to seeing women in their lives, normally their mother or their grandmother, being treated negatively. Sometimes this was linked to parents separating and being brought up by a single parent, and seeing the injustices that came with being a female single parent, and seeing them take challenging pathways through life. So for example, Jack, obviously these aren't people's real names, Jack, one of the Swedish participants, talked about his grandmothers being an inspiration because they, one had a particularly challenging life within the family, and the other went into education and became a priest, which at the time there was great resistance to women becoming priests. So in that case and in others, they saw particularly, and I don't really like the word inspirational, so I'll use it in, academic inverted commas, but in some way, women who they identified as being inspirational to them and making them want to work against the injustices against women. Sadly, another common theme was around personal experiences of violence and abuse within the family. So this is in some cases seeing, for example, siblings being forced into marriage, experiencing domestic violence and witnessing domestic violence themselves while growing up, or kind of early childhood memories where they knew things were happening even though they didn't necessarily label it as domestic abuse at the time. So for example, one interviewee said, "I've got a very vivid memory of an early experience of my parents driving us to a family home and then an aunt getting into the car and she had bruising on her face. It was only years afterwards that I had the language and the frame of reference to understand that obviously it was a domestically abusive relationship that she was in, and my parents were going to rescue her in a way to help her get away, to go somewhere safe." But grandfathers, fathers, brothers and uncles, men in families, were also influential in different ways. Sadly, most of the time, this was because the men commented on a lack of a positive male figure in their childhoods while they were growing up, with men in their family taking a particularly kind of backseat, hands-off or strict approach to them. And they're the words that were used by our interviewees. In its most extreme form, one of our Swedish interviewees actually described his father as an anti-role model, so the very thing that they were very determined that they didn't want to grow up and become. There were some other examples where men had been positive influences within the family, sometimes outside of the family. So for example, youth leaders, but most of the time, unfortunately for this, it was around kind of wanting to not be like other men that they experienced in their life. We did see a theme around alternative, non-conforming or marginalized masculinities when growing up. So kind of feeling that, they weren't quite one of the crowd, they weren't one of the cool guys, they weren't part of the football crowd. So somehow feeling different. And sometimes that's because the men were growing up gay within their culture, and sometimes they weren't able to openly do that, or that they felt somehow different to their peer group. And they felt uncomfortable within that. particularly when they were kind of surrounded by people who they saw in the family as being kind of hypermasculine, and not kind of representing who they felt that they were growing up and wanted to become. Being a father is a huge thing to try to sum up, but we did see that this was one of the turning points around men's kind of not necessarily becoming involved for the first time, but in terms of ramping up that involvement, of feeling like the time is now that I wanted to do something. So this was part of a gradual progression, as was men and boys' violence against other men and boys. So seeing the violence that was happening around them at schools as they were growing up, childhood bullying, most often by other boys, especially when there was examples of abuse which were related to disability, ethnicity, and sexuality intersecting with their growing up as boys. So these were kind of the gradual ways, and these kind of factors, there wasn't necessarily one, but there could be multiple factors that intersected. If we could have the next slide, please, Stephen. But there were some examples, probably 3, where it was less gradual. So it wasn't this kind of ongoing childhood, adolescent, adulthood kind of stepping into the movement. The ways in which it was less gradual were being influenced by a specific high-profile case of men's violence against women. We saw this particularly in some cases around in Spain, where there was particular key places that kind of really shook the nation and made had an increase of men and boys saying, actually, you know, this is just this cannot continue. And this was, I think, linked to some of the high profile cases and then the marches and media attention around these cases. But there were also cases, certainly in the UK, and I think to a lesser, but still there in Sweden. So being influenced by high profile cases. And this often led to kind of a quicker, a less gradual impact involvement in, but often it had already been kind of bubbling around, so they might have had some of the more gradual influences as well, and it was the high profile case that acted as a particular trigger to actually starting to take action. Another case, in other cases, and this was only the case in a few examples, this is where men were catapulted into the work due to a personal tragedy themselves. So this was around personal tragedies around members of their family getting seriously injured or killed due to violence against women. And this affected them in a different way. You know, these men traditionally hadn't been doing any work even around gender-based inequalities. It really wasn't on their radar until it was forced onto their radar by a personal tragedy that they experienced. And finally, employment or professional involvement. So we also saw a different route in for men who were given domestic violence as part of their work remit. And I think this has been seen in other countries as well, where and some work in the US, where this professional pathway into men's anti-violence activism is becoming one of the pathways in. And one of the things that we saw was that when men kind of got involved through the other gradual progression, it was around seeing men and gender inequality. So they saw the gender inequality and the sexism first, and then they found the issue of violence against women. Where men got involved through employment or professional involvement, it was often that they came to it through the violence against women lens, and then they began to see the other forms of gender-based inequalities afterwards. I could read you out loads of great quotes, but I'll stop there and I'll let you read the book yourself, and I'll pass on next to Stephen. Sorry, to Sandy.
Thanks, Nicole. Glad to see your son becoming involved there, by the way. So I'm going to talk about chapter 3, which is about being involved in activism to end men's violence against women. As Nicole said, you know, women were a key influence here as well, but not within the family, but actually in more professional and activist circles. So women in the feminist movement supported men to be involved. They were friends, they were co-workers, they encouraged, they challenged male allies, and that could happen either off or online. But there were, of course, and there are some significant tensions with women's groups, and this has been written about quite a lot in the past. So the risks of, for example, men taking over feminist spaces or undermining women's voice, women's leadership, diversion of funding from cash-strapped projects supporting women, such as refugees, rape crisis centres, and so on. I mean, there's quite a lot to say about tensions with women groups, but I'll just summarise it as in this quote from Pablo, not his real name. Brilliant choice, by the way, whoever chose that. Very stereotypical. So the relations between feminist and pro-feminist groups described as good relations, but not close relations. Could I have the next slide, Stephen? Now, another risk that was identified was that of putting men on a pedestal. And again, that's been recognised in other work. We did a survey around all the risks, which I haven't actually shown as a graph because there isn't sufficient time. But in the survey, 65% of the 40 men who replied either agreed or strongly agreed that men's efforts and voices could receive more attention, more value than women's. And so it is a significant issue. And there are some additional risks here. Of course, the pedestal effect, as we might call it, following Messner et al., that can get more men involved, but you have to then question the motivations of some of those men. So if they're in it because they want praise or status, then that's precisely the wrong reason to be involved. And I think we would concur with Dean from the UK, who said, well, maybe I'd be better off taking a step back because men are in the foreground too much. And another of our respondents said, you know, it was important that men in standing back also highlight the work and the knowledge, and I think the history of struggle of women colleagues and the projects that they've initiated over the years. Next slide, please, Stephen. Another issue is around talking the talk, but not walking the walk. So this is about male activists not behaving in non-violent or gender equal ways. As you can see, you know, almost half the men in the survey agreed or strongly agreed that this was a risk. And there are high-profile examples for a number of countries, including Sweden, I think UK, US, and so on. It points to a lack of reflection before getting involved amongst a range of issues. As one Swedish respondent put it, superficial change or support, not revising our own masculinity. And that raises the importance of issues around accountability, having proper procedures in place, and indeed self-reflection. And I put a quote from a UK respondent there. So we need to engage in a constant dialogue with self. And I remember Michael Flood has written, the Australian sociologist has written that men have a responsibility to be introspective if they're going to work in this area. And I think that quote reflects what we found as well. Next slide, please. So there are personal costs to being involved in this area for men, being considered to be a gender traitor, so-called. And that can mean that men are reluctant to speak out as it goes against the status quo. It can be considered unmanly or emasculating or effeminate even. And that relates to men's conditioning: be tough, be strong, don't act like a girl, and and also therefore their unwillingness to talk to one another about sensitive issues like relationships, like violence. We also found some obstacles, some resistances in men's personal lives, so tensions with family members who didn't like what the men were involved in or didn't agree with it. And some issues around online abuse. I mean, clearly there are costs here for men, but of course, women have taken the brunt of the force of criticism and harassment online, but men get some too. I just wanted to point out too the role of organisations working with men and boys in providing support and opportunities to speak out. I mean, actually, I won't talk in any more detail about those organisations because they were all mentioned in the first slide, I think. But Men in Sweden, Beyond Equality in UK, and the Men Engage Iberia in Spain being prime examples. Okay, next slide, please. Another whole set of issues is around men's relationships with other men, both as personal friends, as peers, and as mentors. So this can be important for some men in maintaining their involvement in this activism. But for others, there can be problems in their friendships with men. I mean, particularly the issue around gender symmetry, what one might call that. So, you know, friends saying, what about men in this? Why aren't you addressing issues around men? You know, and that occurred quite often. But some men did find support from other men doing similar work, and also from women, as I've said, perhaps more so. This area, of course, can be one where men can feel isolated, and that can make sustaining their activism harder to achieve. There is a role for men's groups. That can be a route to supportive friendships, to exploration of gender issues, and also to political action. And I think, as we've heard, you know, those kinds of groups are apparently increasing in number in Spain and Sweden. I wouldn't say they're so common in the UK. I don't think we mentioned that there are some yes all men conversations going on following the Sarah Everard case, which I think are quite interesting. But I'm not aware of other self-organised groups at the moment. Another thing to acknowledge, which was mentioned before, was under COVID, of course, a lot of the work has moved to online platforms for sharing experiences and challenges. And any of you who are aware of the Men Engage Ubuntu process will know that there's been a huge range of discussions around masculinity and feminist issues going on online. You can look at it all on their YouTube channel. And within Europe, Men Engage Europe, I'm actually on the steering committee for Men Engage Europe, has been running a series of regular fora for men and women working in this area to share experiences and to find support in this difficult time. So some things are happening transnationally rather than just nationally or locally. Next slide, please. So there are some examples we found of visible political demonstrations with other men, but most of that comes from Spain. And we found that Spain was the closest to having a pro-feminist, anti-violence men's movement, you know, and having regular vigils and demonstrations and marches as part of that. I mean, I think they would say, and Custodio will probably confirm this, it's actually a relatively small number of men, but on the other hand, they do seem to have done more and be more organised than some of the men in other countries have been, or the other countries we've studied. And there is something powerful about that. It enables men to feel at least that they're involved in a community of like-minded people. I just wanted to end by mentioning backlash politics, you know, the negative organised reactions to women and feminism and the significance of those. And clearly there are established men's rights activist groups focusing on what they would call masculinities in crisis. I would say that's a very limited way of looking at masculinities. There's a huge element of continuity as well as change in relation to masculinity, and privilege endures significantly, as we know. But the connections of those groups to far-right politics, or just right politics even these days, to ethno-nationalism and to the online manosphere are important and significant. I think Stephen will probably say a little bit more about this, but clearly backlash politics needs coordinated responses, and that must include pro-feminist groups providing some positive counterpoint. Okay, I'm going to stop there and pass on to Stephen.
Thanks, Sandy. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just try and go through my slides quite quickly, so we've got time for some discussion as well. So if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat. But yeah, so I'll just talk to you a little bit about the last chapter, which was looking about, you know, what did our participants think about how we can get more men involved in this work. And so I think quite a common view we wanted to ask them first, well, like, you know, are there particular groups of men that are more likely to speak out about men's violence towards women? And I think a lot of our participants felt that it was actually particularly young men, and in particular men who were already involved in other social justice movements, whether that's anti-racist activism, or environmental activism, for example. And quite a few of our participants also felt that gay, bisexual, trans, queer men were more likely to have a kind of consciousness about these issues because of their own experiences of, kind of their forms of masculinity being subordinated in some way, perhaps. And then participants felt that men who were kind of belonging to like right-wing groups or men who were in positions of power were perhaps less likely, or the least likely groups to speak out. And some were also a bit expressed some concern that obviously on the one hand we want men in positions of power to be speaking out about these issues, but is there also a risk sometimes that when they do, it's more for their own ends, perhaps, as part of a political campaign, for example, rather than actually because of a genuine commitment to the issues. And then something which was discussed quite a lot was like, what impact does privilege and oppression have in all of this? So as you can see from the quote towards the bottom there, quite a few participants felt that if men have experienced oppression or discrimination themselves because of their class or ethnicity, for example, then they were more likely to also have a kind of consciousness and a sense of solidarity about violence against women. But on the other hand, it's perhaps easier for men in positions of privilege to kind of have the access to like feminist knowledge and to just have the resources and I suppose, yeah, perhaps not face as much challenge in their day-to-day lives in order to speak out about these issues. So there can be both challenges and opportunities there in terms of both different forms of privilege and oppression that men might experience. We also asked, like, are there particular spaces where men might be more likely to kind of speak out? And the space which was felt to be most likely in that regard was within kind of non-governmental, voluntary community organizations, because participants felt men were more likely to be exposed to kind of feminist ideas and arguments in those spaces. Also within kind of left-wing political, left-leaning kind of political groups and organizations, perhaps. But it was also pointed out by some participants that often within kind of left-wing spaces, gender equality issues have been kind of perhaps a little bit marginalized and are treated as a bit of a diversion or a luxury sometimes, when social class is treated as like perhaps the primary, in economics and capitalism, treated as the kind of primary issues of concern. Some participants also felt that kind of settings where empathy and caring for others are particularly valued, such as social services, education, healthcare, that those were particularly likely spaces for men to, or more likely spaces for men to engage in these issues. And one of our participants made the point as well that like higher education can be a really valuable space to raise these issues. It gave him opportunities to talk to hundreds of students about things like violence against women in a way that you might not have opportunities to do that elsewhere. And as was already mentioned, higher education was a space where quite a lot of our participants also really started to learn more about and engage with feminism and violence and abuse. But yeah, as I said, there's perhaps opportunities and challenges around dealing with other forms of oppression and inequality which men themselves experience as well. So quite a few of our participants talked about, for example, in their work, they had encountered challenges engaging with working class men who might, in some cases have a sense of feeling left behind and forgotten by society, and therefore talking to them about male privilege, can be a challenge. But at the same time, real opportunities there. As Robert, again, these are all pseudonyms, of course, says, you've got the history of trade unionism and struggle and solidarity there, which can be built on. And another participant, Abbas, talked about perhaps, how particular social groups' experiences of racism, Islamophobia, for example, can also provide insights into women's experiences of oppression. And he also made the point that actually there could be a lot more done within kind of religious settings and spaces where you've got large groups of people who could potentially be engaged with, large groups of men included, who could be engaged with about this. Another question there was about generational differences. So as was mentioned, perhaps young men in particular were seen as more likely to be taking on or to have a kind of a consciousness and awareness about gender inequality. But John in Spain also made the point that he felt that in his activist kind of spaces, it was that they were actually getting older, like generationally, and there wasn't seemingly a new generation of young men taking their place, which perhaps suggests that the ways in which young men are expressing their views on this and their activism on this might be different in some ways to how previous generations have practiced it. And it was also, the point was made about the real value from having like intergenerational conversations, among men, for example, and learning from each other in that way would be really beneficial. So we looked at what are some of the factors which might encourage men to take action. I won't go through this now, but obviously you can find all of this in the book. But I suppose perhaps the key point among our participants was that we need a lot more education for young people and children from a really young age about gender equality, about preventing violence against women, perhaps as part of kind of broader citizenship education. So Didac from Spain said, we need to educate in equality from nursery school onwards, real equality. Across the curriculum as well, not just within kind of PSHE or sex and relationships education, as important as that is. And it was felt that, men won't start taking more action on this unless they feel like they have the knowledge and the understanding and the skills to be able to kind of back that up. So that's why this education is so important. And of course, the media has a really important role to play in this regard as well. And as we know, can often actually be kind of unhelpful in the messages it sends out about violence against women. But not just young people, of course, also across the life course. We need a lot more engagement. Perhaps some of our participants suggested there are like key moments in men's lives, such as becoming a father, where it's really important to engage with them on these issues, or there are real opportunities there. And also we need a lot more efforts in the workplace, for example. As Nicole mentioned, the workplace can be a really important space for men to speak out. And we did also look at, what are some of the kind of obstacles to men taking action. And interestingly, one issue which came up there was in Sweden, how, actually this idea that Sweden has already achieved gender equality could actually sometimes be a barrier, that men would say, oh, well, isn't this problem already solved? And also that there was perhaps, even though there's quite a strong gender equality discourse, there was less awareness about men's violence against women within that. Although, of course, at the same time, it was recognized that there are the kind of policy levers and mechanisms in Sweden which perhaps don't exist in other countries to help tackle these issues. But generally, I think there was a sense among our participants that there's a lack of political leadership in all three countries. And that was felt especially in the UK and Spain, a real lack of high profile male politicians having an awareness of violence against women and speaking out about it. And I suppose there was a comment there that, you might have politicians making statements saying, yes, like violence against women is abhorrent, but in terms of actual policies to back that up, there's a real lack there, perhaps especially in the wake of austerity measures in the different countries, really cutting back on this kind of work. Yeah. And then there was a kind of, just the last few slides now, I'll try and wrap it up quickly. There was a kind of, some of the participants talked about the struggles, about how to get the balance and how to get the right language in kind of appealing to men, but at the same time not kind of, actually challenge them at the same time about their attitudes and behaviors, and which obviously, as Sandy said, that's something that men really need to reflect on when getting involved in this work, and looking at how we ourselves are influenced by patriarchy and harmful ideas of masculinity. We did conduct the research while Me Too was kind of at its height. So we did ask our participants about the impact of that as well. And there was a real feeling that it had a big impact, but perhaps especially in Sweden and the UK, less so in Spain. But Spain subsequently had its own version of Me Too called Quintalo in the wake of the so-called Wolfpack case, where there's a really powerful movement against violence against women. So I suppose there was a point there that you can't just generalize, and it's easy to think that something like Me Too has impacted all countries across the world, but actually, real divergences, even just among the three countries that we looked at there. I'll skip that for lack of time, and I'll just to sum up. So I suppose our findings, we found both similarities with previous research in terms of things like, as Sandy said, some of the tensions involved in men doing this work, the importance of that women in men's lives play in getting them involved. And thinking about these issues, for example, but we also found some new things and some new questions opened up as well, such as, on the one hand, often it being a very gradual process of men getting involved, but on the other hand, for some men, there is that being catapulted in because of certain events or experiences, for example. And as Sandy said, another issue which is really becoming more and more significant is the role of the kind of backlash and the manosphere, and I suppose what can men's groups and kind of anti-violence men do to try and kind of tackle some of the kind of quite harmful ideas that are coming out of that. We also felt that because of all the different social movements which were taking place over the course of writing the book, things like Black Lives Matter, environmental movements having a real impact, there's a lot to learn there and a lot of engagement that could be beneficial for everybody involved, you know, for men who are involved in activism against violence towards women, of course, to think about how these issues intersect with other forms of inequality, and how we could perhaps play more of a role in also speaking out about the climate crisis, and for example, and how that connects to patriarchy and ideas of masculinity. And we thought that, you know, the research really showed us that there's a lot to learn, both from doing this kind of transnational research, which can also present lots of challenges, interesting challenges, of course, but also there's a real need for those kind of local perspectives to come out more as well from a range of different countries, because clearly men's activism on this looks very different in different countries. So there's a lot to learn there from different contexts. And just lastly, yeah, we asked the question, you know, because of all the conversations that have been taking place in the UK in recent months, because of the Sarah Everard case, because of COVID-19, where we've seen things like domestic abuse be exacerbated, you know, are these issues actually prompting more men to get involved? I mean, it seems like they are in the short term, but yeah, how will that play out in the longer term is a question which remains to be answered. But yeah, I'll stop there, and perhaps we can move on to some questions and discussion now, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. We will leave a minute at the end just to go back to that final slide, because we did have something else exciting to announce as well, didn't we? I mean, exciting in it's about as exciting as academia can get, but still pretty exciting for us. So we do have two questions in. One from Jeff Hearn, who is saying, what about the trade union sector? Stephen, I know this is something you've looked at a little bit, so I might come to you and then also to Anna-Lena and Custodio to ask whether there's any, whether the trade union movement is at all involved in work with men and boys in your countries. Stephen, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have seen some trade unions kind of campaigning about violence against women and on other gender equality issues. But I mean, from my limited view of that, I suppose it seems to me that has overwhelmingly been led by women. You know, we're not seeing, I think it's probably a kind of space where more men are conscious of these issues than other spaces. But I think there's a lot more that could be done there, actually, in engaging men in the trade union movement. And because of those shared ideas of solidarity and collective struggle and things, you know, I think that could be a really valuable space actually to engage more men. And obviously their trade unions still can be quite kind of macho male dominated spaces as well, so there'd be a real benefit from men involved in that kind of work reflecting on these issues. Yeah, so I think it's a really great point from Jeff there.
Anna-Lena?
Yes, I can add to also with the limited experience in terms of trade unions. Our study didn't really indicate a strong influence in relation to trade unions, but I'm sure, as I will just add to what Stephen said, that there is a great space and that trade unions can strongly contribute to this field, I would say. Thank you.
Yeah. In Spain, I would say that the trade unions have not had special importance role. Yeah, it's starting these last years, a couple of years or something like that. Is starting to make some campaign about it, but it is not a special role or place where man for gender equality has been developed. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Helen says, you rightly address the importance of early intervention and education. In the UK, this is a challenging idea in the current educational political landscape. Did we find any examples of how this had been done in Spain and Sweden? So maybe if we come to you first again, Anna-Lena?
Mm-hmm. I think in terms of the preschool in Sweden, they have quite a strong, they work strongly with gender equality and discuss gender on average about attitudes and how you communicate, and also about, I mean, clothing, how you dress, and attitudes towards each other. So I think there is this important work going on in preschools in terms of then children's attitudes, if you focus on that. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna-Lena. Custodio, is there any work that's going on in schools or preschools?
Yeah, it's starting in Spain to get into curriculum of future teachers this kind of gender equality topics. Much more should have been done, but things are moving. Okay, things are getting. People starting to do things and developing materials and audiovisuals, and things are going on, are moving on. Okay.
Thank you. And I don't know, Sandy or Stephen, whether you wanted to add anything else about the UK? No. Certainly a place where gender equality is taught from before preschool and above is, yeah, one of my dreams. It seems so simple, doesn't it, to be doing, yet just certainly here isn't really happening at all.
And I mean, it's interesting that I wonder if things will change there, because obviously we have now got mandatory relationships and sex education, and then schools are being really challenged about, because of the Everyone's Invited campaign about sexual harassment at schools. So I feel like there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction that, oh God, we need to be doing more on this. But so yeah, it'll be interesting in the long term if that does lead to more like in-depth work on this. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can add something also that relates also maybe to, maybe I'm forego Nicole here, but Helena Merit is commenting about gender equality, and also like the Swedish government has now encouraged also, for instance, that the social work programs in Sweden are implementing work on that sort of includes knowledge about violence to women and violence in intimate relationships. So that has sort of is on the table, and that's so kind of increased knowledge and encouragement to have that in the curricula also at the university levels. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, really important. Helena's asking, is there any thoughts about expanding this further? Yes, we did try to expand it further in a project which unfortunately we didn't quite manage to get the funding for, but if anybody on this call has any funding or is interested in working with us to expand this work to other countries, do get in touch. It's something that we are continuously interested in. There's a few comments now coming in. We've probably only got time for one more because we do want to just share this end slide. So I'm just going to come to the question by Dee, who's asking, is there any work being done within football? I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that and wants to comment in any order. Sandy?
I mean, just to say a little bit, I mean, there are probably people who are on this call who know more about this than I do, but I know White Ribbon Campaign, and again, Stephen might want to comment here, has done quite a bit of work with sports clubs generally, not just football, getting them to adopt sort of, how do I say, white ribbon status, which then involves a certain number of commitments about, sensitizing members of the clubs around violence against women, particularly the male members of clubs. So there is some work, but I'm, the question suggests that much more could be done, and I'm sure that's true. I mean, when you look at the Euros and some of the stuff that was happening around then, clearly there is a need for more work around the connections between violence and football and masculinity. So, Stephen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think Women's Aid have done a bit of campaigning, haven't they, trying to get some football clubs involved in this. And as you say, White Ribbon did manage to get Calvin Phillips, one of the England players, and the Leeds team, they wore White Ribbon shirts. But yeah, I think that was actually something which was highlighted by our participants, that sports clubs could be doing a lot more on this and would be a really valuable space, obviously, to engage with lots of men and boys. But also, we were having a conversation, weren't we, about actually, was the current England team, were they actually bringing into question dominant ideas of masculinity? And Gareth Southgate, the manager, were they practicing more caring form of masculinity, which is quite interesting. But I don't know if Anna-Lena or Custodio, if there's anything from Spain or Sweden about sport and men.
Please, Custodio.
Okay, in Spain, something is happening about increasing feminine sports, mainly through campaigns in the media and less in the schools. I can't say much more. Yeah. Anna-Lena?
Yes, well, I wouldn't be able maybe to say directly about research on relating to football or soccer, but at least attitudes attitudes relating to masculinities are discussed of course, in Swedish sports, and also in relation to LGBTQH issues. So that is sort of an ongoing debate, and that is I think it has sort of increased over the years. So that is, and unfortunately, more research needs to be done in this field. So, thank you.
Yep, in a classic academic ending, more research needs to be done in this field. I think we will come to wrap up now. Could you just share that final slide again for me, Stephen?
Yeah, can you see that? Okay.
Yep, that's great. So it's just to say thank you for listening. Do follow us on Twitter. Do join us if you want to be on our mailing list and receive invites to other webinars, and even maybe in the future in-person events with coffee and scones. But also the exciting news is that we are launching our first podcast on Thursday. So you can hear the advert by Sandy and Stephen, Now and Men, Current Conversations About Men's Lives. If you either follow that link, or if you just type in Now and Men into wherever you get your podcast from, I believe is the line that is in the advert, and it's a great advert. We're not going to play it now because it would just, I think, embarrass Stephen and Sandy too much. It's never nice to hear your own voice back, but I've listened to it and I think it's fantastic, and I'm really excited to listen to the first episode on Thursday. So do follow us, follow the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today and giving up your time on this beautiful summer's day.